It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. And it's a really interesting time of the year in a lot of ways. It's commencement time, and it's also the end of the legislative session, which is always a good thing in many ways. And we'll talk more about the outcome of the session later in the conversation. I attend a lot of commencements, and a lot of people would say, you know, how do you soldier up to that? But the reality is, for me, it's the proof of our product is these students we produce. I mean, the central mission we have around education is the conferral of degrees and commencements. So this year in Knoxville alone, I think I'll go to architecture is on the list, social work, and nursing. And I always go to veterinary medicine because it's my profession. I'll do a couple other commencements across the state. I think Martin's on the list and the Health Science Center. And by going to those three this year at Knoxville, to give you some perspective, I will have attended commencement-wise in the last 4.5 years, every college's commencement here at Knoxville. And I try to do Chattanooga and Martin too. But they're great celebrations. And I can tell you the experience of shaking hands and the experience of the enthusiasm of the crowd in Tennessee is a notch above other places I've been from the standpoint of the accomplishments of the students, particularly the undergraduates coming across the stage. And it's real heartwarming to feel how special people think it is to receive a degree from the University of Tennessee, and what a great celebration it is. The institution produces 11,000 on average graduates a year. That's the largest number in the state from the standpoint of universities. And we're working hand in hand with the governor on his drive to 55. And, it's an effort to get 55% of the population with post-secondary credentials by the year 2025. And we're currently at about 33% in the state, and we're doing our part. But this morning, really, I'd like to talk to you about the evolution of, if you've read the papers, the broken business model, the unsustainable business model that I felt we're in at the University of Tennessee across the entire system. And historically, what really transpired was, it was probably last April or May, about a year ago this time, that as we were getting ready for the June board meeting, and if you know our operational calendar, the June meeting is where we look at tuition increases, we look at how we did coming out of the legislative session, we look at what we want to do, where we want to go get stronger, and how we're going to make our investments. And a big part of this is, in my head, what at that time was, these tuition increases that on my watch had been 6, 8, or 12%. I started to reflect on the sustainability of that. And the fact that what was happening was, over time, we had just had the two curves cross. From the standpoint of state appropriations in support of education, higher education, and the degrees that students get, and the provision of resources to get educated from families or their students via tuition dollars. And so what has happened as we have continued to have to struggle with state appropriations is that we've gone down a trail of increasing tuition to offset the decrease in state appropriations. And then I also thought about a couple other things. One, I thought about our land grant roots as an institution. Founded in the 1860s, right, from the standpoint of land grants. The whole notion was founded in the 1860s by a fellow by the name of Justin Morrell, who was a senator from Vermont. And there were two issues why Senator Morrell decided to create the land grant system, and I think it took 2 or 3 sessions of Congress to get this thing passed. But the first step was to provide solutions to the people's problems, particularly around agriculture and mechanical arts. And the other thing was to connect the people with the institution when they had a problem so that you could figure out what the problems were and then try to answer them as a university. But the other part of this that ties back to sustainability and increasing tuition was, it was also a bill created in order to provide additional access. Because in the 1860s, you had to come from a wealthy family in the United States if you were going to be able to find a university to go to and could afford it. And so it was also about access, and I started to think about a public education and a land-grant mission that tied us to access, and whether increasing tuition all the time was limiting some people's access. And in reality, in most cases across our system, if you look at debt burden of students, it's the working class families that struggle the most. Lower socioeconomic families typically have more institutional support awarded to their students. And so it disproportionately has cost the working class families across our state when we look at our models. The other thing about the concept was we had to figure out how to solve it ourselves. We own this problem, it's ours. And I also had under my belt a number of legislative sessions here in the Ag Job 4 or 5 and 4 in this one. And my tact had been regarding our appropriations with our elected officials at various hearings in Nashville it was a bit like, I described it to Deb once, like being on Santa Claus's lap. So you go to a budget hearing and you say, here are all the great things the men and women at the University of Tennessee are doing, and oh please Santa, here's our list of things we need to keep doing it, and please help us and allocate resources to do it. And I started thinking through that process, and the reality was I'd not really provided much consequence when they didn't have Santa come with our Christmas list. And then I remembered a book I'd read a long time ago in the early 1990s by a fellow named John Cotter. You may have read the book. It's called Leading Change. It's about big change, and that's what we're talking about here. And I remember that Cotter had said the fundamental reason things don't get changed is you can't create urgency. So I thought, well, you're not creating any urgency, Joe. You know, you give them a list, you tell them all the good things you're doing, you hope they'll help you. But when they don't, there's no consequence. And so that started because we're able to backfill with tuition in order to keep moving our programs forward. So we created a model looking at the next 10 years. Butch Peccolo and the team in finance and all the CBOs got together across the system, and we put together a model that we initially finally called 330, but basically it had these premises. If the inflationary rate is 3% or less, if we hold tuition at 3% or less, and the zero piece is the state appropriation, which is $477 million of a $2.1 billion budget for the institution across the state. If it just stays the same, doesn't go down, doesn't go up, where do we land in 10 years? And then if you add to it trying to figure out how to compensate our people more competitively, how to deal with our additional costs of deferred maintenance, which, oh, by the way, we have almost $600 million of it. The number you get to as a gap when you get out there 10 years from now is $377 million. And then I basically said to our chancellors, over the next 2 budget cycles, we're going to operate as if over that 10-year time frame, these next 2 years, we're going to close that gap, and we have it apportioned year by year. By the time you get out to the very end, if you accumulate all the gaps over that 10-year time frame, it's about $1.2 billion. And that's with just state appropriations staying even, us holding tuition at 3% or less, and an inflationary rate of 3% or less. And then our board endorsed the approach at the last board meeting, and we put together a budget advisor group to help us through the process of saying, what are the boundaries going to be, or conditions for our institutions across the system in dealing with closing that gap. So, for example, we said that we don't want enrollments to fall, that perhaps we need to take more out-of-state students. In this business, it's like any other one, like the ones you're in. You all understand it. You either have to generate revenue or cut costs. And so we have to be entrepreneurial, we always have to be more effective and efficient, and we have to drive the place toward excellence along with it all. But the key issue here is, what are the conditions under which the limits that the chancellors have in running their part of the operation that we're calling boundaries? And so we set up some boundaries that included looking at program realignment and consolidation. We're going to get into a workforce development approach. We may have fewer people around, but more people working harder. We're going to create allocation and reallocation plans to deal with capital maintenance that we're deferring, to deal with growing stronger programs in areas where we want to get stronger. And just perhaps we may even get into the fourth E, which is elimination, which is always a difficult subject. If you've been around universities as long as I have, if you want to eliminate something, and Dr. Johnson can tell you, it's really hard. And, you know, it might go something like this. So through study, a chancellor at one of our institutions, let's just pick one. Let's not pick Knoxville, let's pick Chattanooga. So Chancellor Angle might decide that he's going to go through a process reviewing the programs that are strong and weak, decide where he wants to take the institution with his team, and decide that he wants to eliminate the widget-making degree. Notice I'm not picking any degree because I don't want you to walk out here saying they're going to eliminate something other than the widget-making degree at Chattanooga. Well, you can expect what will happen, right? Well, number one, all those widget makers out there. Oh, and by the way, we have also looked across the system and across TBR's system, and they're doing a similar thing, although we're ahead of them right now in our move toward this sustainability of our budget model. So we look across the state and we say there are widget making programs at Martin, Knoxville, Tennessee Tech, and University of Memphis. So there's plenty of capacity to make widget makers through the programs we have. And therefore, at Chattanooga, they're going to eliminate the widget making program, and they're going to invest in engineering or whatever discipline they choose to grow strong. Let's say it ties to the Sim Center and ties back to Oak Ridge National Lab. They're really good at simulation, and they want to build on that program because it's a premier program for them. Well, even with all that study, I know what to expect. The widget makers are going to be aggravated with Chancellor Angle and me for eliminating the program. But that is a consequence, right? And we had it happen during session over the issue of out-of-state students enrollments growing in order to close our budget gap. During a hearing, the same kind of phenomena, and the shoe drops then, because then I can say, just like I did in that hearing, well, it's pretty easy to fix if you don't like it. And that is, if we had greater appropriations, we could keep that widget making program, but we have to be very effective and efficient, and that's the way state government wants to operate, and that's the way we need to operate. And therefore, I'm sorry you're disappointed, but that's where we're at today. So it's a different concept when you start to look at realignment and consolidation. We're very concerned about unfunded mandates around tuition waivers and discounts, because if you look at the waiver amount in our system, it approaches $60 million in waivers. And so the reality is, of that $60 million in waivers, we receive about 10 to 15% of it is cash. And so what typically happens in replacing those dollars is there'll be a policy promulgated and approved that provides additional tuition waiver that the state provides to some group. It could be, you know, sons and daughters of Iraqi veterans, or it could be some other special group. And we're expected to do that. Sometimes they include revenue to replace the tuition dollars, and other times the paradigm has been, y'all are doing it anyway, so it's not a big deal. Well, the reality is it is a big deal, and when we're looking at these kinds of gaps over the next 10 years, we have to look at all of them, and so we're going to try to tackle those. We're going to looking at our tuition structure, as I mentioned earlier. Our two regional campuses in Chattanooga and Martin have the ability to look at probably a regional model, because they're both border campuses in which you model out 250 miles from your campus into, say, if you're in Martin, Missouri, Illinois, Kentucky, and say to those citizens, you can come at a hybrid tuition model in between what is a true out-of-state tuition and the current in-state tuition. So at Martin, for example, the in-state tuition in round numbers is about $7,000. Their out-of-state tuition is about 18. They might go at 11,000 for those students. Better yet, I think eventually, and University of Memphis just did this, and I have accolades to them about it during the session, they actually have just had a bill passed to allow out-of-state students in their border counties within 35 miles of the campus come at in-state rates. That would be very helpful to Martin and very, very helpful to Chattanooga. So we could generate revenue. We would still commit to educating just as many Tennesseans or more, but you might think of it this way: we're going to go to a non-resident model in order to allow us to keep tuition low for the in-state students with either a hybrid tuition model or a full out-of-state tuition model. Knoxville, which you're all interested in, obviously has advantage because the supply-demand curves for an education at Knoxville are advantage to the campus and the university. More people want to come here than Chancellor Cheek and his team can serve. And so there might be the ability to increase out-of-state enrollment slowly over time while educating just as many Tennesseans in order to generate revenue. This creates tension, it creates consequences, and we had questions about it in a hearing this past session. Most interesting thing about that hearing was the chairman of that committee quickly said to the member who was concerned, if I was Joe, and he pointed to me, I'd be doing this too, because it's his only way forward. We don't have much say in this anymore. We pay about 25% of the bills for the university, if you look at the $2.1 billion. If you look at the educational piece, they pay about 30% of it. If you just look at what we call E&G budget, the students are paying about 70%, and the state's paying 30% of the cost of an education at one of our places. So he's got to do what he's got to do, is what he said. So we'll be looking at other things around non-formula fee structures. So I don't know how many of you use Extension or are familiar with the Institute of Public Service and its work, say, with industry and companies and lean management and things like that, consulting. And we have to look at the cost the cost of our delivery and whether we're covering all those in our non-formula units. So you might think of it this way. This is a pretty good model because I know it firsthand from my background. So if you're out in West Tennessee and there's a soybean field there and you have a producer who says to one of our extension people who's an expert on soybean diseases, come check my crop because I'm worried about it. I think I might have soybean rust. And we charge now nothing for that. I mean, it's part of our mission as a land grant. Yet on the other hand, we're in a circumstance with Extension in which they don't have enough state support, federal support to continue to do that. They need to look at those costs and whether they need to start into an approach for special diagnoses or other things, whether there should be a fee assessed. That's part of that. If you have a $10,000 crop out in the field and it's going to be $50 to check your soybeans out for rust and give you some advice about how to fix it, seems fairly reasonable. But that's a paradigm shift too, and I know the Farm Bureau really well. They probably will not be real favorable about that. But the reality is we can't pay all our bills and close this gap if we don't get out of the box from the standpoint of generating revenue in new ways. And then we're going to be reviewing the tenure, post-tenure process at our institution. I'll begin by telling you that the vast majority of faculty, having been one for about 18 years at the University of Illinois, are working really hard and doing a really good job. And it's just a few who become less productive as they get older, and then we don't have adequate mechanisms to deal with them. It takes a long time. It's cumbersome. The approaches toward severing your relationship or terminating an employee with tenure, and it should be easier than that. And so we will be working through an approach to revise and look at board policy around tenure. It's not been dusted off and looked at for 10 or 15 years, and it's time to do it in tandem with this. We can't afford to not have everybody performing at least satisfactorily anymore. I mean, that's been my party line. You might imagine it doesn't make me very popular with faculty, but it's not my job to be popular with them, but instead to manage the institution moving forward in the right way. So we continue to do more with less all the time. We educate more people with decreasing dollars spent per student educated. It's actually dropped about $2,400 over the last 5 or 6 years, and yet we're producing more degrees than ever. We'll have to keep doing that. And I think the key about this whole process that's different, and I've felt it a lot because we've been around the entire system talking to people, is it's now, instead of the legislature doing it to us, it's really wholly different if you go through a bad cycle financially because the economy's in the tank. What happened with the Great Recession, I guess, because it's a circumstance that somebody else is doing it to us, and this is Joe doing it to us. So it feels different, and there's some disappointment pointed at me. But again, I think the key here is if we want to be sustainable, if we want to be the kind of place we need to be, we can't count. I've been here almost 10 years now on legislative sessions that occur like the one we had this past year, or one other one that I remember that's pretty good. Because the reality is, in 10 years, we've had 2 pretty good ones, and 8 okay to poor ones. So the reality is, it's our responsibility to fix this over time, just like it would be in your business if you've got a revenue issue, and you need to figure out how to close the gap in your business. And so we're taking a different approach. But again, shifting gears now to the legislative session, it was really a good year. The formula for the completion agenda that rewards universities based on their performance, and we always perform top 5. In fact, we were top 4 this year again, was fully funded, and that didn't happen last year. So that's about $10 million that comes into our system as a result of that being fully funded. There was increasing funding for the non-formal units too, improvement dollars to help them out. There was funding for partial funding for a salary increase, and that's another thing that most people don't understand. Dr. Johnson does, of course, but I wouldn't expect many of you to. So when you see in the newspaper or in a publication that we provide that the state is going to provide a 1.5% cost of living increase for our employees, the raise file we get from the state, the dollars we get from the state, are actually only 55% of that 1.5% number. So we are predicated by that policy in doing a tuition increase just to find those monies or other monies to make it all work. So when you see 1.5 and you think, well, that's a cost of living adjustment and they're going to do market and merit above that, we've got to go find the market and merit too. But the 1.5% is only funded for the formula units, those are the campuses, at about half of the money, 55 cents of every dollar. We were funded capital-wise. We've done very well the last few years. Will mentioned it. At Knoxville alone, we've had $1.3 billion worth of buildings go up over the last 5-year time frame. The campus is totally different. You've all probably been by it, and it looks a lot different and a lot better. But I would also caution you to realize while we've done $1.3 billion and $1.8 billion across the system, the majority of those dollars have been ones we've found ourselves, donors, and then what we call auxiliaries. I mean, dormitories going up. You know, the people in the beds are going to end up paying for those. We go out and incur debt, and then we service that debt over time by making sure we have students on campus and enrollment stays up and people in those dormitories. So about of the $1.3 billion at Knoxville, it's roughly $400 million of it came from the state, and the rest of it was money the university got a hold of one way or another. We were funded for the next science laboratory, which will replace Walters on campus, and we were funded for a 4-H center in West Tennessee to replace a 4-H center in Milan that I had the unique honor and recognition of closing when I was at the Institute of Agriculture, which wasn't a popular decision, but we've got a great new place for that program to serve the students and families in West Tennessee. So we can't rest, even though we've had a pretty good year from the standpoint of the legislative session. And, you know, I think the other thing that I'll tell you is our advocacy and our ability to get near to where Dr. Johnson was, and his reputation and ability over in Nashville is coming closer and closer. We had a couple of really interesting advocacy calls and advocacy alerts that mobilized people for the university, and it feels good when you know you're making an impact and people are saying to me in the plaza, hey Joe, would you please tell them to stop? I'm with you on this, and my email account's blowing up. My phone's ringing off the hook because we're for you and we understand where the people are across the state. So I think You know, if you can do one thing for me as you leave, before I open up for questions, it's to realize, and hopefully you buy in, that fixing our business model is very, very important. And that when we do incur bumpy air and we disappoint people, or you hear people grousing about a decision we make, that hopefully you can continue to support us and articulate in some way how you feel it's the only way forward for the institution. The reality of our state budget is there's a structural deficit in it, largely caused by increasing costs of health care. It's about $34 billion, the state budget. If you look at the parts of the pie, higher education's about a quarter of it. Another quarter of it's health care, and the balance is everything else the state does. Within the education corridor or allocation, by state law, monies that go to K through 12, which I don't second guess at all, it's very, very important, come based on law and policy. We end up being discretionary, and therefore, unless we can create a different tenor in Tennessee about consequences and urgency, I don't think we're going to see appropriations shift. I don't think we're likely to see increases in taxes. And so as a consequence, our biggest way to solve this is working through it ourselves and being entrepreneurial and finding new revenue. I appreciate your attention this morning. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. And thanks.